Welcome to Didactic, CAPS Board Study Edition. I am your host, Dr. O'Leary, a child and adolescent psychiatry fellow in the National Capital Region. This is a podcast I designed to help myself and other CAPS fellows study for the boards. But anyone interested in human development and child and adolescent mental health will also probably get something out of it. So for a rundown on how this podcast was produced, see episode 1. And I'm saying that because I am using AI frequently to assist me with the content creation. Episode 1 explains how I do this. Even though I use AI, all of the content in the podcast should be considered to be my opinion and no one else's. I take full responsibility. Today, I'm going to move on from just the general milestones that kids meet to different ways to approach development. Some people call them theories. A lot of them are kind of untestable, so I hesitate to use the word theory, and I'm going to use the word approaches a lot, but I'll also throw around the word theory as well. And the place everybody starts, of course, for modern psychology is Freud, and a lot of what was done later was kind of based on Freud. So I'm going to start with Freud, even though he didn't really study children and just sort of, I guess you could say, looked backward from his ideas about adults and tried to apply them to children in a logical way. He didn't really study kids, but his ideas were applied to children and adapted to children in many different ways. So today I want to cover Freud and later move on to Anna Freud, and then object relations, which is really based in Freudian theory. So these are theorists like Klein and Mahler. And I think that will be enough as far as the psychosexual approaches to child development. Freud understood that development must happen in some kind of stages. And he focused each of the stages on an erogenous zone because his basic ideas were that we had this drive or this id, and these drives were the things that when we were younger were kind of the primary thing motivating us. And so when we were born, we enter what's called the oral stage because our mouth is the thing in which, we derive pleasure from the world, in which we interact with the world mostly. These different stages are also identified by some kind of conflict. And it's not just Freud. A lot of the different approaches use a kind of a conflict approach. So for Freud, the oral stage conflict resulted basically when the mother starts to wean the infant. So the big conflict is separation from the breast. And Freud believed in something called fixations. So if you didn't quite make it through each stage successfully, you might become fixated, which means that you retain certain habits from that stage that you would have progressed through potentially. For example, if you get fixated in the oral stage, you are more likely to overindulge in food. You'll have eating issues, probably smoking. You might bite your nails, things like that are focused on your oral regions. So getting fixated in this stage can have different sorts of consequences for someone. They might develop what is called an oral receptive personality, which means that they're kind of dependent. They're passive, kind of gullible. They expect people to give things to them, like a mother offering her breast. Or they might develop an oral aggressive personality, which is sort of like demanding, hostile, sarcastic, argumentative, where they're really trying to get that breast and they're angry that they're not getting it. The next stage is the anal stage, and this is where kids kind of derive most of their pleasure from figuring out, how to control their bowels, how to control their bladder. And so the key conflict in this stage is toilet training, being able to put your excrement where it should go, basically where it is socially acceptable for it to go. Now, fixation in the anal stage results in things called anal retentive or anal expulsive personalities. And an anal retentive personality is someone who is kind of obsessive, compulsive, even very rigid in their thinking. So if you think of an obsessive compulsive personality, this is anal retentive personality. An anal expulsive personality is more kind of messy, disorganized, even kind of rebellious, oppositional. For an anal retentive personality, there's this focus on perfection. For an anal expulsive personality, there's almost like a rejection of perfection, like a leave me alone, like I'm good enough. I don't need to learn how to poop in the right place. The anal retentive stage occurs, it's about 1 to 3 years. So the oral stage I mentioned earlier lasts until about 1 year. The anal stage lasts another couple years, so from about 1 to around 3 years. And then a child enters the phallic stage. This is from about 3 to 6 years of age. And the focus here are genitals. So kids derive most of their pleasure by exploring like their genital area. This is when they become aware of gender differences, and in this phase, by around 6 years old, that's when Freud posited boys have developed an Oedipus complex and girls have developed their Electra complex. And these complexes are unconscious desires for the opposite sex and this kind of rivalry with the same sex parent. So for boys, they fear to be castrated by their father because they're competing with their father for their mother. And girls fear not being able to experience sex because of an over controlling mother. So getting through this stage is all about being able to kind of identify with the same sex parent. So it's not just a competition, but kind of understanding how to fill the role that that parent filled for you. Fixation leads to primarily like sexual anxieties, difficulties forming intimate relationships with other people. So if you had a phallic personality, because of fixation in this stage, you are more self-centered, vain, kind of sexually aggressive, kind of more narcissistic, you might say. But you also may become like kind of histrionic, trying desperately to get attention from other people. And fixation in this phase always comes with some sort of sexual dysfunction. So pleasure in sex is difficult to achieve, or it's unsatisfying. After 6 years of age until around puberty, that's when Freud said we enter this kind of latency stage. So this is stuff kind of settles down here. The sexual energy is kind of suppressed, and if you've successfully gone through the phallic stage, you just start chilling for a while. There's development of the superego, friendships, understanding your role in society, schoolwork, hobbies, things like this. But there's not a lot of conflict. It's more just about kind of exploration of the world. But then when you hit puberty, you hit the genital stage, and the genital stage is the final stage. So this is when mature sexual interests develop. This is when intimate relationships should be formed and healthy sexuality experienced. Fixation at any previous stage is going to mess up the genital stage pretty bad because the individual is not going to be able to develop intimate relationships. They're not going to be able to fit into society in a way that avoids conflict. So let me go back and just briefly summarize all of that. Freud believed we go through stages and we have to overcome some sort of conflict in that stage. And it's an unconscious conflict. We don't know that we're doing it. Um, when we're born, we enter the oral stage because our mouth is the thing that we use to experience pleasure and to explore the world. Um, the primary conflict in this stage is weaning, so being pulled away from the mother's breast. If we get fixated in this stage, if something happens that makes it impossible for us to resolve the conflict of separation from the mom, we can develop two types of personalities. One is an oral receptive personality. So that one's more dependent, more passive, more gullible. It's a personality that's like begging to have the breast put into their mouth. They need someone to provide for them. The other is an oral aggressive personality where they really, really are kind of hostile, sarcastic, argumentative. It's as if they're trying to grab that breast and force it back into their mouth. The anal stage, 1 to 3 years. The key conflict here is toilet training. Um, if you get fixated here, you could be anal retentive, which is kind of obsessive and compulsive, very rigid, inflexible in thought. Or you could become anal expulsive, which is the opposite, really, kind of messy, disorganized, rebellious. And this is due to whether or not you've mastered defecation or you have not. And if you have not, there's two ways to not have done it. One is that you feel compelled to perfect the way that you poop, and the other is that you just kind of don't care anymore. You've kind of given up trying to master that stage. The next stage, 3 to 6 years, the phallic stage, the key conflict is the Oedipus complex or the Electra complex. So this is desire for the opposite sex parent and competition with the same sex parent. If you get stuck here, then you can develop a phallic personality, which is more kind of self-centered, vain, sexually aggressive. You might call it narcissistic. Um, or if for women, they use the word histrionic. And there's difficulty in developing intimate relationships. But that doesn't really come about until the genital stage. But before we get to the genital stage, there's this quiet period called the latency stage, where you can't really get fixated here because there's no general conflict. It's just a developmental stage where kids are exploring the world, sort of perfecting different skills that they already have. The last stage, which starts with puberty, is the genital stage. And this is where everything gets messed up if you're fixated in any of the previous stages, and all of the conflicts you haven't resolved are going to come out. And the genital stage lasts for the rest of your life. So in the next episodes, I'm going to move on to the Freud who actually was far more important for child psychology than Sigmund Freud, and that's his daughter, Anna Freud. And then I'm going to talk about other approaches that kind of use the psychosexual framework, including the object relations approach, which has theorists like Melanie Klein and Margaret Mahler. So that's what's coming up. If you have any suggestions for me, you can go to psydactic.com and fill out the form there. I appreciate any feedback I can get. I'm Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Psydactic Caps Edition. Nothing in this podcast should be considered personal, medical, or mental health advice.